Welcome back for part 2 of American Musical Theater, the 1950s into the 1960s.
Hello, Dolly. This is Louis Dolly. Funny glad to have you back where you belong.
In May 1964, Louis Armstrong's rendition of Hello, Dolly spent a week at the top of the charts, breaking the Beatles' run of 3 straight months. It was one of the last times in the 20th century that Broadway had a number one hit song on the top of the Billboard charts. Well, the culture was definitely shifting, but Broadway was basically trying to ignore the 60s. The typical music at the height of the Vietnam War would be something like How Now Dow Jones, celebrating Wall Street, or George M., which celebrated George M. Cohan, or shows like Promises, Promises, a romantic comedy. These shows had absolutely nothing to do with the main culture of the moment. It was really the consummation of the Broadway musical falling out of sync with pop culture. And then, of course, this came along. In Cabaret. Cabaret was 1966, and at that point, the protests and demonstrations were becoming an unavoidable presence across America. Hal Prince, the producer, he was also directing shows by now, and he was inspired by the civil rights struggle as he prepared a new work with music and lyrics by John Kander and Fred Ebb. It was very stormy in our country when they started work on Cabaret, and Kander brought in a photograph from Life magazine, a 2-page spread of a bunch of Aryan Nazi boys snarling at the camera. And of course, the shock was it was our country, and it was them snarling at some poor little girl. So he used that to support the contention that wherever human beings are, we need to be aware that terrible things can potentially happen. Cabaret was an adaptation of the Berlin stories of Christopher Isherwood and a play that was based on those stories. The show depicted the debauchery of Berlin between the wars and the Nazi rise to power, presented by a master of ceremonies at the Kit Kat Club. From the perspective of a soldier in 1949 in Germany, there were many of these little nightclubs, one of which was called Maxine's, which was the cellar of a bombed-out church. And they had a very diminutive MC who performed by coming out on stage with lipstick on his mouth, eyelashes, and rouge, mainly to hide how old he was. So in the musical Cabaret, Joel Grey played the MC. He made up in a way that even if you knew what he looked like, he'd be unrecognizable. He comes out and starts singing a song that we all now know is an opening welcome. But audiences at the time looked at each other and said, is this a show that's all in German? Because he started by saying, Welcome, bienvenue, welcome, welcome. All of it was in all of the different languages of their audience. The whole show was very out there, and it had all the sort of androgynous sexuality that you could ever want. It was mind-blowing, and the audience was baffled. It had a stronger effect on the perspective of human sexuality and culture, certainly than Fiddler on the Roof did 2 years earlier, or Hello, Dolly. You felt as though you were seeing something completely different. Cabaret, I would say, would push the envelope of what people were seeing in a Broadway musical. Most people thought it was a terrible idea to do a musical about Nazi Germany, but Hal and John and Fred and Joe Masteroff had this very dark vision, and they found a framework in terms of the cabaret songs in which the musical numbers commented on the action. Boris Aronson did the original set. Nobody's been a greater set designer than Boris Aronson, if you ask me. Anyway, what he had to create was there were basically two musicals on stage at the same time. On one stage, the play took place in real rooms, and on the other, it took place in limbo. And in limbo is where these numbers, which indirectly commented on the real book upstage, could happen. Somewhere in the middle of the second act, Sally Bowles leaves the real world and walks through a mylar curtain into the unreal limbo world and sings cabaret. Let me give you a little of Liza singing cabaret.
What good is sitting alone in your room? Come hear the music play. Life is a cabaret, old chum. Come to the cabaret. Put down the knitting, the book and the broom. It's time for a holiday. Life is a cabaret, old chum. Come to the cabaret. Come taste the wine. Come hear the band. Come blow your horn, start celebrating. Right this way, your table's waiting. What good's omitting some prophet of doom? So wipe every smile.
Now, as she's singing this lively number, at the end of this song, she decides to get an abortion. What she's found out at the beginning of the song is that she's pregnant. What she decides at the end of the song is she doesn't want to have the baby. That's pretty powerful material for a Broadway musical comedy. I think that the thing that you kind of have to take on board is that there's this very profound disruption in the culture of Vietnam and the awareness of the American public that they were in this terrible war and they couldn't get out of it. And they knew it was not really winnable. It was on some level, at that point, even then they knew it was probably unjust. And in song and in theater, there was a great deal of protest against the war, and it divided the culture. But this was not showing up on Broadway stages until we come to the musical Hair. Suddenly you've got rock music. The pop culture, the sound of the pop culture, has started to enter into the Broadway musical and the Broadway stage. For financial backing, they sought out Joseph Papp, a maverick producer who had just created the Public Theater, a non-commercial venue downtown known for presenting Shakespeare in Central Park. Papp was also a champion of contemporary theater. Vietnam was a major plot point in Hair, but the war wasn't really the main thing. The main thing was the lifestyle. And in that lifestyle, it was about self-realization, expanding your mind. This musical seemed to be more about hippies, growing their hair long, living a bohemian life, more worried about self-realization than career, and wearing all kinds of different clothes, and definitely different hair.
Long beautiful hair, shining, gleaming, steaming, flaxen, waxen. Give me down to there, shoulder length or longer. Yeah, baby, there, mama, help me with daddy, show it, long it's got breeze and get caught in the trees. Give a home to the fleas in my hair. A home for fleas, a hive for the buzzing bees, a nest for birds. There ain't no words for the beauty, the splendor, the wonder of my hair. Blow it, show it, long as I can blow it my hair. I want it long, straight, curly, fuzzy, snaggy, shaggy, ratty, matty, oily, greasy, fleecy, shining, gleaming, steaming, flaxing, waxing, dotted, polka dotted, twisted, bead, braided, dotted, robert, and confetti, tangle, 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 and spaghetti.
The show was called Hair, and it was the first Broadway musical with an entire score of rock music. The writer had never seen a Broadway musical when he had done Hair. He just knew that he liked funky music, so that's Hair. And when they said, well, we want a rock and roll score, he said to himself, well, that's me. That's what I can do here. It was the first show that allowed the generation gap that had appeared at this point in time when pro-civil protest, rock and roll, and dope, and all of it arrived all at the same time. Somehow, at this show, parents went because they wanted to understand their kids. Kids went because they wanted to show their friends what the movement was about. It filled that communication gap very, very well. The stage manager even remembers that every singer, when they had the auditions, every singer, dancer, hippie, panther, you name it, we were all online waiting to audition for the show. And we went into a series of rehearsals like I'd never seen before. Unlike any other theatrical show I think I've worked on. We didn't start with the script and the blocking and jump right in. We started with a lot of exercises dealing with caring for one another, loving one another, in order to then give that love back to the audience.
At one another, short of breath, walking proud in our winter coat, wearing smells from laboratories, facing a dying nation of moving paper fantasies, listening for the neutral light, with supreme visions of lonely tears.
Somewhere inside something there is a rush of greatness. Who knows what stands in front of outlines and passion, my future on films in space. Silence tells me secretly everything. Manchester, England.
Trying to figure out where the country would go from this very dark place. There was no volunteer army at that point. Now we do have the volunteer army. Then it was the draft. So pretty much every young man you know was going to get pulled right out of their life and sent to Vietnam without a lot of warning. So this was a topic that the audience could really, really get into. With its downtown run completed, the show moved first to a disco club called the Cheetah. Then with new director Tom Hagen at the helm, Hair moved to the Biltmore Theater. Drug use, obscene language, a cast intermingling with the audience, frontal nudity, they were all central to Broadway's newest hit. I think it affected a lot of people. Hair ran on Broadway for 4 sold-out years. And along with its enduring hit songs, the show helped to establish the world of off-Broadway. It also helped to establish how you now develop a show. You wouldn't just base it on a star or base it on a hit musical. You wouldn't just try it out of town. You would want to experiment, workshop it, showcase it. And as it built and as the audience got more and more interested, you'd pull in more and more and more ideas from the audience, so that there was much more of a give and take as you developed the show between the creators and what the audience wanted to see. This show really helped establish that pattern. It established the world of Off-Broadway and Joe Papp's Public Theater as important new players in the development of the commercial music and what could be expected from a Broadway musical. Remember to check my courses, enter in the discussions, look at the assignments, answer the quizzes, and I will see you at the next lecture.